Hi, I'm really glad that you are joining us today. I've got a special guest. Her name is Rosie Wilby, and she's a comedian and an author. And I would go so far as to say an activist. I don't know if she would characterize herself as that, but she's definitely on a mission to use her humor and reason, I think, to help change the world in a positive direction. Rosie, welcome to the Shame Free Zone. Thank you so much for joining me today, all the way from the UK.
Yes, hello from London. And I definitely would use the word activist because I think I'm definitely trying to create changes in the way that we think about relationships and the narratives that we have around relationships, and break out of some of the sort of traditional models that we often think are the only ways and the only scripts for our relationships. So yes, I think activism is definitely something in my blood. I've always been an LGBT activist and part of the kind of lesbian and gay movement here in the UK. So it's very much the way I think about things, is trying to create positive change and move the discussion forwards.
Well, as a queer identified woman, I identify as bisexual, even though now that term has kind of fallen into, oh my God, aren't you fluid? Or, pansexual or something. No, I was actually there in the 90s helping to bring that term forward. I wrote for, I think it was 5 years, for the first and only national bisexual magazine called Anything That Moves. And I was out there in the gay parade, protesting for bi visibility. But I really do think, however you identify, if you are queer identified, your existence is activism. It really is,
Yeah.
because you have to navigate so much shaming and marginalization, and in the case, of course, of bisexual people at the time, at least, very invisible. Now
Mm.
we're just kind of a cliche, I guess. But But Rosie, I would like to read a little bit from your bio, just so that our viewers get a little deeper sense of who you are, aside from the fact that you're beautiful and eloquent. Rosie Wilby is an award-winning comedian, podcaster, speaker, and a journalist. She regularly appears on radio and TV commentating on sexuality, dating, and love, and was dubbed the Queen of Breakups. We'll have to find out what that means. By BBC Radio 4, following the success of her podcast, The Breakup Monologues. I've listened to the Breakup Monologues. They're very good, funny, and enlightening. She has
Thank you.
extensively explored heartbreak on her podcast, in her hugely successful comedy shows, and in her first book, Is Monogamy Dead?, which was shortlisted for the Diva Literary Awards and longlisted for the Polari First Book Prize. She has written for publications including The Guardian, Sunday Times, and New Statesman, and has performed at major festivals including Glastonbury and Latitude. I love Glastonbury. I haven't been there for a couple of decades, but oh my God, I stayed in a bed and breakfast there. Every morning I would see the mists of Avalon come over Glastonbury, and a little lamb would come into the kitchen for a bottle of milk. Oh.
Wow.
Yeah, I could go on and on about the tour and the chalice well and all that stuff, but I won't. London's great too. I love London as well.
Lots going on here. Yes, yes.
Oh my God, yes, yes. London's awesome. Have you lived in the UK all your life then?
I have, yes, but not always in London. But I always wanted to get to London because that was where cultural, interesting things, activism, political things, queerness, all those things were going on in London, really, rather than in the north of England where I grew up. So yeah, I was very keen to get here. But I have enjoyed time that I spent in other parts of the world. I have spent a little bit of time in the States, in New York and in LA. I did a really fantastic queer writers retreat organized by Lambda Literary.
Yes.
Yes. And So I was at USC in 2016 for the summer with Sarah Schulman teaching me nonfiction writing, which was incredible.
Wow. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, well, Los Angeles is very different than Northern California where I reside, but still part of
Mhm.
California, and I've spent lots of time down there. Um, can we just talk a little bit, since we're talking about shame, would it be okay
Yeah.
if we talked a little bit about your coming out story?
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, that's interesting, really, because I've often talked about coming out on stage, and I talk about how my mum was very, very embracing of me being a lesbian. She was actually incredibly excited about having a daughter who was a lesbian, and it was kind of almost a bit cringy for me. And so she was kind of getting out lots of, because she was an English literature lecturer, and so she loved books and writing, so she was getting lots of lesbian poetry and lesbian authors and lesbian novels out of the library, and buying all these books and reading extracts at the tea table, you know, with me and my dad kind of slightly cringing. And she was always telling me about her and some of her female friends that had been very, very close, and I was like, oh, okay. So
Oh,
almost like she could have been gay in a different era, perhaps, and she was sort of vicariously enjoying me coming out. But that was, I mean, it's lovely, it's very sweet. But my dear mum is no longer with us.
oh.
But I guess at the time when you're a teenager, you can't quite deal with your your parents being so embracing of it, and sort of then kind of talking about their own desires and sexuality. You don't want them to have to have had feelings or any kind of desires or ideas, or they're your parents. They sort of exist in a whole other space. When you're a teenager, you don't think of them like that.
I know that that's true for most people. It was never true for me because I could actually hear my mother having orgasms down the hallway. So I knew my mother was a very randy woman. But it's funny. She actually identified with my attraction to women to discount it. She said, "Well, how do you know you're bisexual?" And I said, "Because women's bodies, I find them very attractive." And she goes, "Oh, honey, everybody does." So to her, that meant you're not bisexual, you're not queer, because I'm attracted to women too, and I'm straight. Um,
Right.
and when I did marry a man in the 90s, and my mother was so relieved that I was finally going to be normal, quote unquote normal by her standards. And then who shows up by invitation, of course, but my former girlfriend that I had been with for a year. And she kind of scandalized the wedding because she showed up in a mini skirt with a bunch of cleavage. My mother was just furious, and she goes, "What is that woman doing here?"
Amazing.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is that regardless of whether your parent is excited or horrified, coming out can be a little bit fraught with parents. Um,
I think so. I think coming out is so fraught. I mean, maybe it's getting easier. I still think it seems to be very difficult for young people. And it's just interesting, isn't it? Because if you're heterosexual, you never have to have that experience of coming out. It's just assumed.
right.
So it is a strange experience. But when I came out in the UK in the 1980s, it was or right at the very end of the 1980s. Like 1989, it was still very, very homophobic times here, and well, I guess around the world in general. So I in a way I was lucky that my mother was one of these very forward thinking progressive people who was very accepting, because that was not generally the atmosphere around. So yes, but I think what's interesting is if you are gay, and especially if you've come out at a time when there's a lot of opposition to that, it does make you start to think outside of the box anyway about relationships and question structures like marriage and monogamy, and whether these traditional scripts for relationships are the only way to do things, because you've already broken free of the you know, the assumed norm about sexuality. So I think in some ways you can go there, or, you know, because you've already made part of the leap. And I know a lot of gay men who say that. I have many gay male friends who have more open relationships, sexually speaking, but perhaps have a primary partnership that they are committed to and stay in for a long time. And that really interests me, that gay male divorce rates are so incredibly low compared to everyone else. And it does seem that, you know, open relationships and having some kind of negotiated set of rules and boundaries does seem to work very well for them. But I think it's interesting how in the LGBTQ community, you do see a lot of ideas being kind of pioneered, if you like. It's like a good experimentation ground. And then these ideas get taken on in the wider heteronormative community. I mean, things like even conscious uncoupling, you know, which we all associate with Gwyneth Paltrow. But I think that lesbians were consciously uncoupling for decades before that, because it was a small community, and women were probably going to bump into one another, and your ex was probably going to get together with one of your friends. So you had to try and separate ethically and remain amicable. And also just to sort of be united in the face of prejudice, really. So, and also things like friends as family and living apart together, and the idea of logical family that the writer Armistead Maupin kind of uses. He describes logical family as this kind of community rather than necessarily the biological family structures that we, well, certainly I grew up with thinking that was everything. Whereas I think what being gay has taught me is that community can be everything.
Absolutely. And I know, you know, my family of origin is really dysfunctional. Mostly all a bunch of very conservative, evangelical, religious nuts, um, who are hypocritical as the day is long, because the vast majority of them molested their kids, including my dad. So I got to see the hypocritical side of a good society. You know, pounding the Bible and then pounding your wife, not in a good way, like hitting her face,
Yeah.
and molesting your kids. And that was just so rampant on both sides of my family. There's obviously a lot of trauma involved, but for the most part, my family of origin is actually pretty toxic and dangerous. And so it's not even safe for me to really have them as family. And that's why chosen family for me is so crucial. But I would say when I moved to San Francisco in the early 90s and got active in the bisexual movement, and later on in the sex worker rights movement, that was really my first introduction to alternative families as well. And as being, you know, family with your community.
Yeah.
Because you do find yourself, at least at those times when there was less acceptance, it was so vilified and marginalized. And I remember there was, this was again, like probably 1990. I was dating this guy, and he heard from somebody, had gossiped that I was bisexual, that I also enjoyed women sexually. And he says, I have to talk to you. And I don't even remember his name. It was a superficial relationship. I wasn't having sex with him or anything. I think we'd probably gone out a couple times. He goes, I heard the most terrible thing about you. I heard that you're bisexual, but I just know that can't be true. And I said, no, it's true. And that was, of course, the last I ever heard of him, which, you know, of course, good riddance, but it's.
I thought you were going to say that he'd asked for a threesome or something.
Oh, well, that's
what
the
men
thing,
all want?
isn't it? Yeah, it's either, oh my God, that's terrible, or goody. But it's all about him. You can rest assured. I think that one of the things I just wanted to highlight, Rosie, is how the activism that both you and I have been involved in, and so many other people over the last you know, decade or two, really has changed things.
Yes.
You know, really has. And we are living in a world that still has a lot of prejudices and a lot of marginalization, and yet there is, in the United States, we've got the right for gays to marry, but it is still monogamous. So,
Mostly, yes, yes. Oh, yes, yes.
well, legally, it's still monogamous.
Yes, indeed, yes.
And that's problematic. So just as we had for queer people, an inability to be in the hospital with their loved one when they're on their deathbed, and now that's changed. We still have that problem with polyamorous relationships, where you're not actually married to this person or a blood relative to this person, so you're not considered part of their family by the medical establishment or the law. And so then you don't even have access to medical benefits or, yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's awful when any relationship feels like it isn't recognized, it isn't visible. But I do think the conversation around non-monogamy, polyamory it has evolved so quickly, because my first book was called Is Monogamy Dead? That came out in 2017, but that was preceded by one of my comedy shows was called Is Monogamy Dead, which was the middle part of a trilogy of comedy shows that I did all about love and relationships, that began with a show called The Science of Sex, which was like a kind of spoofy sex ed lesson, the kind of subversive sex lesson we all wish we'd had at school. And then it ended with a show about breakups that morphed into the podcast, The Breakup Monologues, and eventually my new book, The Breakup Monologues. But this first show called Is Monogamy Dead was one that I took to the Edinburgh Festival in 2013. And at that stage, when I was handing out a flyer that said, Is Monogamy Dead? And it had a little survey on the back saying what counts as cheating. And it had a range of behavior, and cheating was in inverted commas, a range of behaviors like having sex with somebody or kissing somebody, or then more emotional things like falling in love with somebody. But there was, the reactions to this flyer that said, ask this question, is monogamy dead, were often quite frosty. There were people who were, not open to having this construct of monogamy questioned. And there were even a few people that deliberately came to the show to be offended. There were 3 sort of older gentlemen who came one day only to walk out after the first few minutes.
Oh my God.
And I just thought, well, I've got your ticket money now, so whatever.
No. Oh, yeah. It's so much fun when somebody walks out on your
yeah
presentation after just getting there.
Yeah, exactly. But it was interesting how it seemed like still a very controversial discussion, and it was like, oh, is monogamy dead? Oh, can you ask that? It seemed like this,
and
really
that was less than 10 years ago.
Yeah, that was less than 10 years ago. But then by the time my book came out in 2017, it felt very much like that was a very contemporary conversation going on in London. And even, some of the glossy women's magazines would be running articles about polyamory and how it was, quite a feminist way to have relationships, because maybe we were doing away with this very patriarchal structure of monogamy. So, things had moved on so quickly within that. It was very noticeable to me within that 4-year time span that the sort of cultural conversation that was going on around relationships and monogamy, fidelity, marriage, non-monogamy, sex, swinging, it had changed so much, and it had opened up.
And it always takes a village, but how delightful to be part of it, right?
Yes.
To know that some of what you did made that change possible.
I'm sure there are plenty of other people as well knocking on doors and creating shows, creating work, creating writing articles, books.
But every one of us brings a piece of it that I think makes a difference. I really do. And what is it? I'm not going to be able to say this the right way, but there's some kind of a tipping point, where you just get so many people involved in a particular movement, and then the whole culture shifts with it. And it doesn't even have to be a majority. So it's important work. It's really heartening. I was just reading an article, I think it was in the Atlantic 2 days ago, and it was all about some of the legal changes that are taking place around how we configure parenting and marriage. And so, for instance, in the state of Utah, they just recently decriminalized bigamy. And I'm not advocating for bigamy. I'm just saying that it was very interesting to me that they started realizing that if these adult people should be able to make their own choices, their own decisions. And there's also some legislation that's gone into effect in quite a few of the United States states. I think it's under consideration California, I'm not sure, but that is enlarging who the parents are. So if there's a polyamorous situation and this child has been parented by, say, 4 people, when there's a dissolution of the relationships, that child is going to be harmed if they're not able to visit all 4 of their parents.
Yeah.
And I suppose divorce kind of paved the way for some understanding of co-parenting, but I was really heartened to see that we are starting to get some laws on the book that are taking some, not just the shame, but some of the oppression out of the lives of people who just are guilty of the crime of loving each other.
Yeah. And it's so interesting, this idea about children being brought up in non-monogamous households, because I think when I was starting to have conversations about non-monogamy and exploring it for my comedy show, that seemed to be one of the things that people were most touchy about, that it would somehow damage the children or corrupt them, or, you know, it somehow be inappropriate for children to be around parents who had open relationships or polyamorous setups with multiple partners. Whereas when I did find a young man who had grown up in a polyamorous household and spoke to him, he was saying that it was just really, really brilliant because there were loads of really happy and fulfilled adults to always be there to play with him and his brother, rather than, you know, just 2 who were overworked and overstressed and stretched and, you know, had too much on their hands. There were, you know, multiple people to always have some time and attention and cuddles and hugs and fun for them, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was here in the United States when Hillary Clinton, I think, was our first lady. She had said it takes a village to raise children. And of course, she was talking about community resources.
Yeah.
But I often think, so if we know that the the idea of just a mom and a dad, who the nuclear family became isolated from community a few decades ago. So it hasn't always been the case, but when that happened, it put so much pressure on the 2 parents, and and then it cheats the children of a good childhood. So I think, you know, helping people to see, yeah, this actually benefits the children. It's kind of sad to me because I'd like for us to be able to just say this is what is good for people, but it does seem like when you start talking about what benefits the children, that gets people's attention.
Yes. Yes. It's like we don't care about adults. We're all supposed to suffer, aren't we?
I know.
I don't know if what it's like there, but I think in the UK especially, there's this culture of I mean, I guess it's changing now with the culture of social media and so on, but if you kind of want to fulfill your own goals and dreams, that seems somehow selfish and you know, not a good thing, a good pursuit to be wanting to pursue your own happiness. That's somehow selfish. And I think there's a lot of guilt attached to, and shame to, actually wanting your own fulfillment and happiness.
Oh, it's a thing here in the United States too, particularly on women. So a lot of the shows here in the United States, I'm thinking about one called Away that Hilary Swank stars in. And I started watching it because I'm a huge Hilary Swank fan. I just think she's an awesome actress. And you know, obviously somebody else thinks so too, because they gave her an Oscar. But she has a recurring role, actually the central role in a film called Away, and it's all about this female astronaut who's going to Mars. And I'm hoping to see a powerful woman, an adventurer, a scientist, and instead, every single episode is about this mother who is so bereft that she left her children home with their dad. And I'm like, okay, what are 2 episodes? But the whole show's premise. So I actually had to stop watching it because I was getting sick to my stomach. But this is a brand new show. I mean, it's like, and I'm 2020. I'm like, really, guys? This is still the script we're operating from, which is that women, good women, are mothers who only think about being mothers. They're not allowed to think about anything else, not even when they're going to Mars.
Yeah, which you think would be a distraction, right? It's so interesting, what you say about women, because I've been thinking a lot about female sexuality and what we believe and these myths that we have culturally and socially about female sexuality, because one of the early chapters in my new book details my experience of going along to participate in a sex lab. These experiments where you are shown erotica and you are having your genital arousal measured and also your pupil dilation, and also you have to kind of fill in forms about what images you were turned on by and stuff. And in a lot of these experiments, they find that men have a real strong connection between what they say they're turned on by and what they are physiologically turned on by, whereas women sometimes have a real disconnect because they sort of put their own sexuality into this small box of either being heterosexual or gay or perhaps bisexual, and we sort of give ourselves these neat and tidy kind of structures around our sexuality, whereas what they often find is that the women, even whether they admit it or not, actually are sort of aroused by almost everything.
Including watching bonobos have sex. So. I'm familiar with Meredith Chiver's work on this in Canada.
Right.
And she found that women, the plasmograph is the thing that's inserted into the vagina.
That's right. Yeah.
And women had a sexual response to watching bonobos copulate. So.
Yeah. I mean, the weird thing with the experiment that I did here in the UK, which was one that was actually specifically looking at lesbian sexuality and whether that followed some of the same patterns that heterosexual women and bisexual women followed. And largely we do, in that we're aroused by a whole range of things as well. But the very strange thing about that was the control clip between, I was looking at male images and then female images, but there was a control clip that in theory was supposed to sort of calm you down to a normal state or, less aroused state. But that was a nature documentary. So that was strange, I thought, in a way. But yeah, it was really interesting to take part in that experiment and sort of think about how my own sexuality is more broad than the sort of cultural label I put around it, because I tend to call myself a lesbian because I seem to fall in love with women. But that doesn't mean that I'm not turned on by, a good-looking man sometimes, by thinking about him or looking at him or, having a fantasy about a man or something like that. So these things are complex. And our desires don't necessarily always fit comfortably into the sort of construct we put around how we actually live our lives day to day.
So true, and we can be shamed for what is our truth. How we feel. I did want to just make a little asterisk here, a little note that some of Meredith Chiver's conclusions about her research are in dispute now, because some people are saying, well, we put women in an unnatural laboratory setting, and we have some research that shows that women's genitals will become aroused if they're afraid or stressed. And there's some argument that is possibly a survival technique that the body evolved to survive rape without hopefully too much damage to the body. I think it's possible for all these things to be true. I don't think one piece of research has to invalidate the other. We can create, an integrated whole here. And the reason I guess I feel that way is because I'm aware of the research about how the female body responds to rape. And I also am aware that the first time I saw gay porn, I saw two men kissing and filleting each other. I was with a group of coworkers. We'd stepped into one of those little booths where you put a quarter in and watch the movie. And, that was, of course, years ago. But they were all giggling and going, yuck. And I was getting turned on. And I didn't know this about myself. And I was so afraid. I didn't want to let anybody know, oh my God, I think that's hot. So, like try to pretend, oh yeah, gross.
Yeah.
But that was just a natural response in my body. I certainly wasn't afraid. The only thing I was afraid of was, oh no, I'm going to get outed as being turned on by gay porn.
Yeah.
So is there any shaming in the lesbian community if you are attracted to male bodies?
I mean, maybe. I think there's obviously been historically a ton of biphobia and kind of a lot of assumptions about bisexual women, oh, they're always going to end up with a man. And I think, the answer to that is that it's possibly more likely that bisexual women are going to end up with a man, but that's just due to statistics and that there are a lot more men around. If you go on Tinder and you you look at men and women, there's definitely more men than sort of queer women who are interested in women. Sometimes that supply can come to an end disappointingly quickly, and you get the "there's no one new around you" message.
Yeah, I've been in that desert, which led me to hit up on straight women. Boy, that was really sad.
Yeah, so I guess I think things are changing now because there is more of a discussion of fluidity in a broad way, and I think that's largely progressive, but also, I think we also do need labels as well to kind of keep fighting for change. So these things are complex, aren't they?
They are complex. I know the first time that I realized that the trend was to say fluid or pansexual, that I was, or omnisexual. There's so many new labels here, but
yeah.
I was kind of offended because we've worked so hard to get that B into LGBTQ. I mean, I literally was in the streets and writing and speaking when there was no B or T. And to work so hard to get the D, the BTQ added to the lesbian, gay, and then have somebody say, "Oh, don't put a label on me." At first, I was like, "Oh my God, have you no respect for all the blood, sweat, and tears that went into this identity politic movement?" But also, I have to say, there is a part of me too that's gotten a little wary of the identity politics and the labels. I mean, I'm reading a book about consent right now, and everybody's kind of brandishing their anarchist punk identity politics. And I'm just like, oh, please get over yourself. And it's not that I don't value the work that group is doing. And I've got friends who definitely identify as anarchist punks, and I love them, and I love what they're bringing into the world. But there is some part of me that can almost identify with, could we get to the place where we could be human and not have the labels? Because once we raise the awareness up and hopefully, diminish the oppression, my hope was that we could just be one big human family.
That's the goal, isn't it? That's the dream.
Is that a goal for you too, Rosie?
I think so eventually. but I just think we're so far away from that still. You know, even in London, where we have made huge strides towards equality for, you know, the sort of, if you like, the good gay, the sort of white middle class gay man, you know, privileged, affluent, you know, there's obviously, we talk about intersectionality, and there are so many people within the queer community who have other challenges and prejudices to combat and face, who, you know, are in some ways even more marginalized now that our community, the sort of broader queer community, has become a bit more fragmented. And, you know, some people are sort of inside rather than being left outside. And so, yeah, it feels like more lonely on the outside, I think, for some people. So I think we're not quite there yet, but yes, of course, ideally one day we'll all just be humans, be people. Let's hope.
Wouldn't that be nice? But yeah, probably not within our lifetimes, though, Rosie.
Yeah.
But
then it is complex, because there's something nice about being part of something, about being part of a community and family, as we were just saying. So would that disappear?
No, there is. I mean, I identify as an alcoholic in recovery. And I really, you know, I love my conversations with other alcoholics in recovery, because there's just certain things we understand about each other. So I think there's always going to be a room for bonding with people who understand your journey. Like, for instance, young mothers with children. I think to be able to talk to other young mothers with children is a really important thing, so that you've got that identification with your journey. But the taking identity politics to the point of division certainly is counterproductive, I think.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to make sure that we not touched upon actually, but I want to hear more about your two books. They have fabulous titles. And, so the first one is Monogamy Dead. Before you tell us about the book, how would you answer that question?
I don't think it's dead. I think it needed some kind of reinvestigation and reinvention. And I feel that I've reclaimed monogamy, because I am in a monogamous relationship now. But I do feel that it's a monogamy that is informed by poly, and by my time spent making friends who were poly and going to some of the kind of sex positive events and sex parties. And I mean, one of the most eye-opening evenings of my life was going to do comedy at a sex party, and it was okay, a fun gig.
So stop right there. We want to hear about that. I know everybody does. I certainly do. How do you do comedy at a sex party? Well, what was happening? Was everybody having sex in the aisles while you're up on the stage?
No. So there's a very short cabaret that's a bit of a warm up to when the sex room or area that's cordoned off at the beginning of the evening gets opened up, and people can go and, you know, do whatever they like, as long as it's all consensual, of course, and respectful of everyone's boundaries and that kind of thing. But yeah, so the main space, party space, had this short cabaret, and me and a couple of other acts were just doing short sets. But I was just so interested, as you know, as a way of sort of being there. I would have been quite nervous about going to a sex party in any other kind of context, but I suppose I felt I was kind of working, if you like, but it was a turn on, and it was exciting and interesting. But I think what was really eye-opening to me was the rules and the rules about boundaries and consent that people were agreeing to and signing up to as they entered the party. And they had a PAL system in place, which is where you have to go with somebody else who will vouch for you and who will take you home if you get drunk, or you're being aggressive or rowdy, or, you know, not respecting people and that kind of thing. So I just felt like, you know, I've kind of had all these so-called monogamous relationships where we've never actually had any discussions about consent or boundaries or what we want or what our desires are. And it's all just these kind of assumed things about what cheating would be, and no real discussion of what any of that means. And I just felt, okay, so if you are going to open up your relationship, it really enforces this greater level of communication, this kind of maturity of communication, but actually you also need that in monogamy too. So that was, I think that was the takeaway message from exploring polyamory for me, was that you need the same values and principles about respecting one another and communicating with one another and sort of valuing other human beings. You need all of that in monogamy. And I kind of think you can sort of be mono and poly in a sense, in that you can be sexually exclusive, which is what myself and my partner are, but you can have an appreciation that you might get other things from other parts of your life, other friends, other people. Or I mean, for me, I receive a lot of fulfillment from my work, from performing and writing and creativity, and that is like another partner in a way. It's a thing that takes up my heart and my headspace and my time. So I think you can have those sort of poly values, but still, if you want to be sexually exclusive, or you might be sexually exclusive for a time, and then that may change, or your definitions of what sex is may change. I think if you're part of the queer community, you're already sort of perhaps thinking in a different way about that anyway. So I went to this event, and I think that really informed my own definition of monogamy. And so I don't think it's dead, but I do think this sort of old version of monogamy that I knew, that was really all about assumption, secrecy, lies, and really a lot of affairs and overlapping relationships, a lot of serial monogamy that was crisscrossing over, a kind of, which was really a sort of non-consensual non-monogamy. So yeah, I think that was such an interesting journey, that book, and the story really combines my own personal journey of kind of thinking about opening up the relationship that I was in and what that would mean and how I would go about that, with actually some of the scientific discoveries and cultural and sociological discoveries I was making. And also I did my own survey, as I discussed. I did print it on the back of the flyers from my Edinburgh show, but I also did it as an online survey that people could respond to about what counts as cheating. And what was so interesting about that was, of course, a lot of people said, well, having sex with somebody else or kissing somebody else, but so closely behind that was falling in love with somebody else. So for a ton of people, it's not so much about what your partner does physically on that kind of physical spectrum, it's actually what they feel. I mean, I think it's harder to control that or police that. I mean, how can you stop your partner falling in love with somebody else? But yes, there were 73% of my respondents to the survey said that falling in love with someone else would count as cheating. So that was interesting, that sort of emotional kind of non-monogamy, if you like, was important to some people, and they wanted to have some feeling of emotional fidelity, even if they had more relaxed kind of sexual arrangements. But it's so hard to police or control.
Rosie, you covered a lot just now, and all of it's really important stuff. I love the fact that you also mentioned that redefining what sex is, because I know the heteronormative assumption is that sex is penis, vagina, intercourse. And you're right. If you are queer, sex is a lot more than that. So there's ways in which I've seen heterosexual people who think they're monogamous engage in other sex acts. As long as it's not penis vagina sex, they don't think they've cheated, which I think is
well, yes. I mean, it's the whole. I mean, you mentioned Hillary Clinton, but Bill
did
not have sex with that woman.
I didn't have sex with that woman. I just came all over her dress. Well, it's crazy. It's actually a form of insanity, this level of denial, and word games. And I'm in a poly relationship, but it's what's called a polyfidelitas V, which means that there is one central partner who happens to be a man, and then there's two partners that are partnered with him, myself and another woman. And we actually have made a conscious decision that we're not interested in having sex with anybody but him, but he has sex with both of us. And so that's what we mean when polyfidelitas. And the only reason I wanted to bring that up is because I just want to clarify polyamory comes in a lot of different ways too.
Yes.
So it's really about, and what you had talked about just a few minutes ago, so crucial, to learn about relationship as a conscious endeavor that's you partner with people around, not something that you enter into blindly with a lot of assumptions, expectations, and denial, because that's usually what happens is people, I often work with couples who got married with totally different assumptions of what the marriage was about.
Yeah.
And I've seen in heterosexual relationships a lot of time where men thought, I'm agreeing to take care of her. I'm going to support her. I'm going to protect her. And what I do when I'm not with her is my business. And then I've seen a lot of heterosexual women get into a marriage thinking, hey, we're going to be best friends and share all our secrets with each other. And we'll only have sex with each other. And they're not talking about this. They just assumed. Right. And so then, you know, years later, they are operating off of a lot of assumptions, and literally had them sitting in my office and said, so what does your partner think about that? Well, I think they think this. And I go, would you like to ask them? Because they're sitting right next to you. And they'll go, no, you ask them. Like, what's so hard about asking your partner these questions? But and in all fairness, I know it is difficult, but you're so right. The poly community really has forged some fantastic relationship and communication tools that I think monogamous people would do very well to learn from. And I mean, read a book or take a class in polyamory just so you can learn about what it means to be consciously engaged with your partner so that you both are on the same page.
Yes, and I feel like that's what I did in my own way. I went on sort of poly boot camp in a sense, as research for a comedy show, really, and then a book. But it was so informative to how to go about living my life, really. But what I particularly love about the poly community is the language that has come about and the new terms, things like polysaturated, which I really love.
Polysaturated. I think I've been there. Well, we're just going to have you back here in the shame-free zone, Rosie, if you'll grace us with
absolutely. Yeah,
so much more to talk about. I am going to have to wrap things up now, though, and I want to make sure the viewers know how to get both of your amazing books.
Yes.
So the second book, which is going to hit book stands in the United States very soon.
Very soon, next week.
Next week?
That's called The Breakup Monologues, and that is based on my podcast, The Breakup Monologues, which people can listen to now on all podcast platforms. And it really weaves my story about trying to finally stay in a relationship, having learned from all of my breakups. And there is a chapter in that about poly breakups and how polyamory alters the conversation about breakups and the sort of the culture of viewing relationships as a failure if they have ended. Whereas I feel in poly world, there's more of a sense of valuing relationships for the time that they thrived and were wonderful, and understanding that relationships change and their nature changes, and maybe you still have wonderful friendship with someone. So there is a chapter all about poly breakups, which includes an interview with evolutionary psychologists Jeffrey Miller and Diana Fleischman, and they were really brilliant. They came onto my podcast when they were in London. There's also stuff about the future of anti-love drugs and love drugs, but lots of interesting stuff for people to read and listen to, and that will be out really soon, published by Bloomsbury, so available at all your good bookshops.
Yes, and I know that you're on a mission to remove shame from breaking up, so that people just realize that that term is so loaded, and people do oftentimes look at it as a failure. But I'm still friends with most of the people that I used to be in relationship with, and I just I think it's, why would you stop loving people that you used to love? Was it really love if you can stop loving them? I don't get it. But
I agree totally. It seems such a waste. It seems such a shame. It seems like this real high wire act, doesn't it? That you're going to be with somebody and then just not be with them anymore. You're jettisoning a whole lot of really good stuff. So yeah, so I really hope people enjoy the book, and also, as we mentioned, the first book is Monogamy Dead. That's available too, and both books I've narrated as an audio book as well, kind of sat in the little studio booth talking to myself.
Did you actually do? You did your and you have such a great audio, such a great voice, so I'm sure it's awesome. Should they go to Amazon or to any bookstore, and also, where do you want to give them your website too? And also,
yeah, absolutely. Yes, I mean, yeah, Amazon is fine, and all the other kind of indie bookstores as well. But I use Twitter a lot. If people are on Twitter, I'm at Rosie Wilby, and also I have an Instagram for the podcast and book at Breakup Monologues. So do come and join me there, and I'm pretty approachable. If you want to tweet at me, if you have thoughts or questions about breakups or monogamy or some of the discoveries I've made whilst immersing myself in the world of doing comedy at sex parties or participating in sex lab experiments or whatever.
Yes, or if you want to interview Rosie for your podcast about her new book.
Absolutely, yeah.
Definitely. All right, Rosie, you are such a delight. Thank you for being such a light in the world too.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm so happy to have discovered you and your work. So thank you.
Well, we will do this again.
Yes.
All right. Bye for now.